We've sure learned a lot since the Dobbs decision was handed down. Roe versus Wade was controversial, but after 15 years, we had reached something of a balance in terms of what was allowed and what wasn't allowed on a national basis. Then came the Dobbs decision and the repeal overruling of Roe versus Wade. And for the first time in the history of the United States, a constitutional right which women had enjoyed for 50 years was removed from the law. Never has happened before. The American people have united together in support of the belief that reproductive rights are a fundamental right and that extremist politicians have no business dictating the health care decisions of women and their doctors. Just a few days ago, Republican lawmakers in 2 states failed to pass restrictive abortion laws, and they were not blue states, far from it. South Carolina and Nebraska. Cheers actually erupted outside the Nebraska legislature when the proposed abortion ban failed. To some, the failure of these abortion bans in Republican-controlled states may be surprising, but if you've been paying attention over the last year since the Dobbs decision was handed down, it's no surprise. In the months since that decision, at least a dozen states have enacted near total bans on abortion, and the number of horror stories that are emerging from those states is staggering. Stories of rape victims as young as 10 years of age being denied health care because of restrictive state laws governing abortion. An 11-year-old victim of sex trafficking, also denied an abortion under one of these state laws. Stories of women being forced to flee their home states to access basic reproductive care service. Stories of pregnant women suffering miscarriages being turned away by doctors until their lives are at risk. Because these abortion bans are so vague and so poorly written that healthcare providers are afraid to provide life-saving care until the women are in an extreme situation. And the laws surrounding abortion and miscarriage management seem to be changing almost on a weekly basis. So much confusion and chaos. Now, one of the most striking features of the Dobbs decision itself was the almost complete absence of discussion of one subject. The subject, women. In a 79-page ruling, women received a few paragraphs from Justice Alito on the Supreme Court. This author of the majority opinion defended his disregard for women's lives by arguing it's, quote, hard for anyone, Justice Alito said, and in particular for this court, to assess the effect of the abortion rights on society and on the lives of women. That's from the man who wrote the decision, the Dobbs decision that repealed Roe versus Wade. Said it was kind of difficult to assess the impact it would have on the lives of women. He was sure right about that. Mr. President, perhaps the court's conservative majority should have paid closer attention to the briefs filed by medical professionals like the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the American Medical Association, who gave Justice Alito and the majority on the Supreme Court fair warning about what was going to happen, an immediate healthcare crisis across America. Sadly, their prediction turned out to be true. Now, last week, as you'll remember, in the Judiciary Committee, we had an historic hearing about the horrific consequences of the Dobbs decision. One of our witnesses I still remember to this day. It was one of the most compelling pieces of testimony I've ever seen. Her name is Amanda Zorowski. She gave one of the most heartbreaking presentations I'd ever heard. Amanda lives in Texas, you see, one of the first states with a near total ban on abortion that took effect after Dobbs. She endured 18 months of fertility treatments in a desperate attempt so that she and her husband could become pregnant. When she finally did, her husband was over the moon. So excited and so happy, they named their soon-to-be little girl Willow. Last August, in the second trimester of her pregnancy, Amanda didn't feel right. She called her doctor and told her to come in as quickly as possible. After an exam, Amanda and her husband received a heartbreaking diagnosis. Her cervix had dilated prematurely. The loss of her baby was inevitable. Amanda asked what could be done, what was the right thing to do for the respectful passing of her baby, and to protect herself so that maybe there'd be another attempt and she could become pregnant again. To her shock, her doctors in Texas told her there was nothing they could do because of the state's new anti-abortion law. Laws that threaten doctors with fines up to $100,000 and up to 99 years in prison and losing their medical license. Amanda's doctors tried to find another hospital nearby that could possibly help her. Those hospitals all had the same response. Because of Texas' new anti-abortion law, they refused to do anything to provide care for Amanda. She told our committee, and I quote, "People have asked why we didn't get on a plane or in our car and go to a state where the laws aren't so restrictive. But we live in the middle of Texas," she said, "and the nearest sanctuary state is at least an 8-hour drive. Developing sepsis, which can kill a person quickly, in a car in the middle of the West Texas desert or 30,000 feet above the ground is a death sentence, and it's not a choice we should have had to even consider. So all we could do was wait." She waited 3 agonizing days, developing a raging fever and dangerously low blood pressure. Sepsis had set in. Her husband had rushed her to the hospital. Several hours later, her daughter arrived as predicted, stillborn. Amanda spent the next 3 days in intensive care in the hospital, fighting for her own life. She has spent the last 8 months battling trauma and depression from this experience, as well as the medical fallout from delayed treatment, including complications which may make it difficult for her ever to bear a child. That's the new law in Texas. It almost killed her. During last week's hearing, we also heard from a Dr. Nisha Verma. She's an OBGYN. She's chosen to stay in practice in Georgia despite knowing that, quote, Georgia's laws threaten to make her a criminal for providing life-saving care to her patients. Dr. Verma told our committee, "Imagine looking someone in the eye and saying, I have all the skills and all the tools to care for you, but the state's politicians have told me I can't lift a finger." She reminded us that the United States already has the highest maternal mortality rate of any wealthy nation. Restrictive abortion laws, she said, are making pregnancy even more dangerous for American women. Regrettably, some of our Republican colleagues tried to make last week's hearing about something they called late-term abortions and partial birth abortions, both medically inaccurate terms. In their fear-mongering, what they neglected to note is that abortions after 21 weeks of pregnancy account for less than 1% of abortions in America, according to the Center for Disease Control. They also failed to acknowledge that in the very rare instance when abortion happens late in pregnancy, it's generally because a woman's life is in danger, or a fatal fetal anomaly has been discovered, or because a woman wasn't able to get an abortion earlier due to restrictive state laws. And as Dr. Verma correctly noted, hypotheticals of patients seeking an abortion until the moment of birth, quote, does not reflect the reality of abortion. It simply doesn't happen, this doctor said. For nearly 50 years, abortion opponents said their only goal was to return the right to decide abortion laws to the states. It's now clear that that was not true. Dismantling Roe versus Wade was always the first step. The real goal is to systematically strip away access to abortion nationwide, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. For example, many congressional Republicans submitted a brief urging one federal judge in Texas to issue a nationwide injunction blocking the use of a medication abortion pill, mifepristone, a drug the FDA approved more than 20 years ago, found to be safe and effective, safer than Tylenol. Congress needs to stop this chaos. The bill, Women's Health Protection Act, will restore the protection of abortion access across the country consistent with Roe versus Wade. That testimony about what that young mother went through in Texas was an eye-opener. I couldn't help but think of my own daughter and my family and what I would have done if she was in a situation where she faced death and had to be sicker for the doctors to finally act and save her life. She waited 3 days in that intensive care unit to finally survive and go on with her life, but her life may never be the same. I pray that she'll have an opportunity to have another child someday. But it gets down to the bottom line, Mr. President, and I think you understand it as well as I do. I'm an attorney, I'm not a doctor, and if I'm asked to make a decision about something as complicated as what to do with a 10-year-old who happens to have been a victim of rape and pregnant, I'm going to think twice and ask people who know what to do for a living, medically trained people who can make the right decision for the people that are involved in that process. To sit here in state after state and have these decisions being made, for instance, to say you can't have an abortion 6 weeks, anytime after 6 weeks of pregnancy. I know enough about that experience from my own family experience that many women will never know the answer to that question in the first 6 weeks. And yet the law is being written by politicians and legislators who think they know better. Many of them couldn't consider passing any courses in medical school, but they're going to write medical law now and in fact insert into the examination room and the emergency room state elected officials who are going to be hovering over those doctors and threatening them with $100,000 fines and 99 years in prison if they guess wrong. What have we come to in this country? I mean, I think the American people understand how desperate we are at this point with the chaos that we face. I can only hope that the election will make a difference. And I think it will. I really sense there is a realignment in this country. The women in particular, but many families are deciding that the Republicans have just gone too far with the Dobbs decision. And what's happening across this country is not only chaotic, it is immoral. It is immoral to have a young woman like Amanda face death when she was trying to do everything possible to have a baby and be a mother, and then had the terrible diagnosis which told her little child was not going to live. That's the reality of where we are today. I hope that the Senate Judiciary Committee can continue to bring this item before the American people so they can hear clearly what we face after the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court. And I yield the floor.